It's time for us to check back in with Alex Stewart and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, look in the description below for a playlist. When you mentioned making juice harps a while ago, it reminded me of your blacksmithing. You said that you learned that from your grandfather. He learned me the different kinds of steel and iron and how to work and temper them. It wasn't long before I was making about anything I needed. I'd gather up pieces of scrap metal anywhere I could find them and make things. Hinges, fish gigs, horseshoes, plow points, and such as that. I'd upset axes and take augers that was wore out and draw them out to make new ones out of them. How were you able to get your iron and steel hot enough to work? You didn't have coal or charcoal then, did you? We made our own charcoal. I've made many a batch of charcoal myself. Historically, the making of charcoal was a rather tedious process. The wood to be burned was stacked vertically and covered with dirt and mud, forming a type of kiln that permitted very little air to enter. This allowed the wood to char, but deprived it of the oxygen needed to sustain an open flame. I would have been surprised if the people on Newman's Ridge had employed such a sophisticated method of making charcoal, and sure enough, Alex knew another, simpler method. Dead chestnut made the best charcoal. I cut the tree in blocks about 3 feet long and then split them into pieces about the size of your arm. I stacked them up crossways and set it afire and let it burn till it got red coals on it. When them coals started cracking open, I'd water it down. Put the fire out, and what you've got is charcoal. You could use that in your forge and it would sure put out the heat. It wouldn't get quite as hot as coal, but it worked all right. You mentioned making plow points. Did you also make plows? Oh shucks, I couldn't tell you how many plows I've made if my life depended on it. I've got a plow up here now that I made and used for 64 years. I took care of it, kept it in the dry when I wasn't using it, and it's still a good plow. About everybody on this creek has borrowed that bull-tongue plow at one time or another to lay off their corn ground with. Where did you learn plow making? Well, Pap followed making them, but he never made one to suit me. I never could get his plows to plow right. He'd put the foot in the beam solid, and it would either be too straight or too crooked. I went out in the woods and cut me a good white oak and split out the red part of it and made my plow. I put the foot through the beam, but instead of making it fit solid, I left a 1/4 inch play on each side of the foot, and I fixed it so it could be adjusted. Everybody that plowed with that plow just about wanted me to make them one. I commenced making plows, and I don't know how many I made. My son-in-law, Marsh Roberts, come down here one summer, and we made 14 plows. We got $12 a piece for them, and I give him half the money for helping. I guaranteed my plows. I'd tell them if it didn't plow to suit them to bring it back, and I'd give them their money. But I never did have to take one back. You made every part of it? I made everything about it. I never went to the store and bought anything. For my handles, I'd go to the woods and get 2 small hickories. I'd boil them in water and bend them to get the right crook, and when they cooled, that crook would stay. They're worth a heap more than store-bought handles. Did you ever make a plow for a person to pull? Yes, sir. The first man plow ever I made was for a feller over here on Mulberry named Thompson. He didn't have a mule or ox to work, and he had to pull that plow himself. His wife would guide it, at least that's what he said. He may have had her pulling it for all I know. A lot of women did that back in old times. When the colored folks was in bondage, they would pull the plows. A man plow is smaller and lighter than a mule plow. I've made a few of them. Alex, most of the men of this region never learned to do that which was considered to be women's work, such as spinning, weaving, sewing, quilting, and cooking. If out of necessity they did learn any of these crafts, I'm sure they kept it hidden from anyone outside their immediate family. But you learned to do all these things. Was it customary for the men and boys to do this kind of work? No, I was the only feller that I knowed that took up such as that. Anything I ever saw anybody else do, I wanted to learn myself. I learned to knit from watching Mama. When I was a very small boy, I'd sit and hold a pine torch for her to knit till late at night. I watched how she done it, and when she lay her needles down to do something else, I'd grab them up and go to knitting. I got to where I could knit a stocking or a sock as good as she could. I knowed how many stitches to put on each needle to get a sock. I believe it was 80 for a man's. It depends on the size you want your sock to be. I understand you're a good spinner. I've spun many a yard of thread. Mama learnt me that too. I used to be able to spin just about as good as any woman, but I don't guess that I'd make much of a hand of it now. Did I ever tell you about being down in Gatlinburg when that woman was demonstrating how to spin cotton? She didn't think you could spin? No. She didn't think I had sense enough to know straight up. She was so independent talking that I knowed she had thought there was nothing to me. I asked her if she cared if I tried spinning on her wheel. She couldn't half spin, just had the wheel barely turning. She said, "What do you know about spinning?" I said, "Well, lady, if I was to damage your wheel, I'd sure fix it or pay you for it." I started on off, and she grabbed me by the shoulder and said, "You can try it if you'll be careful with it." Well, I took a hold of that wheel and give it a great big whirl, and I know just how big a spin it would take to use up that cotton she had there. I just walked back with that cotton in my hand, and when the first wheel stopped, all the cotton was spun into thread. It was the finest thread you ever saw. Hers was big old puffy thread that you couldn't have gotten a darning needle. She come running over to me and said, "Where in the world did you learn to spin like that?" She said, "Why, Law, you can thread any kind of needle with that. Come here and show me how you do that." And I said, "No, I just wanted to show you that I knowed what a spinning wheel was." And I just went on off. You also learned to weave cloth. Oh, yes. My grandmother Levacy had an old maid sister that lived with her named Toad, Aunt Toad. She'd sit at that old loom and weave day in and day out. I'd watch her, and whenever she got up for something, she'd let me weave. She called me Bean Whacker, and she'd say, "Bean Whacker, you're going to make a weaver." She encouraged me and helped me, and that's where I learned to weave. I can see them filling their loom just as well as if they setting right over there. It took them all day to fill a loom. That was tedious work. I suppose you learned every step in making clothes, from the growing of cotton and flax to the finished product. Yeah, I've raised cotton and flax both. It takes more time to get flax ready for use. You plant it in rows in the spring, and of course you have to cultivate it all summer and keep the weeds out. When it gets ripe in late summer or early fall, you pull it up, roots and all, and lay it on the ground to rot. You let it lay there until the outside part of the stalk rots off. Then you put it on a flax break and break it up good. Them little fibers inside won't break, but you've got to get all the hull off. You've got to comb it with a flax hackle and keep working it to where it will make good linen. Many of the old coverlets and dresses were very colorful. What did you use for the dyes? We'd use roots, bark, leaves. Hickory bark and alum makes the prettiest yellow cloth you ever saw. Back then, if a woman had a bonnet or an apron dyed with hickory bark and alum, she was flying. It wouldn't fade. To make a red dye, we'd take the bark of red oak, white oak, and chestnut oak and mix it with alum. Walnut root would make brown, and catnip will make green. There was a lot of other things we'd use to color the yarn: pawpaw root, pokeberries, yellow poplar root. I've gone out and dug roots for Mama many a day so she could dye her thread. We put it in a pot and boil it. Then we put the yarn in. You could dye one hank one color and another hank another color, and when you wove it, you would have striped cloth. The women would make their undercoats out of that pretty striped cloth, and they'd pull up their dresses so you could see their undercoats. Alex, all my life I've heard the expression "as blue as indigo." Are you familiar with indigo, and was it used as a dye? We used to grow indigo. It looked something like a pea growing. It was a vine-like plant that had narrow, keen leaves. I don't remember using it as a dye, but we'd put a little in our fruit, and that would give it a good taste. In enumerating the various crafts, arts, vocations, and avocations in which Alex engaged at one time or another, we should not overlook quilting. But because an extensive interview with Alex on that subject was included in my book, A People and Their Quilts, it will not be pursued here. During the many visits I paid Alex over the past 25 years, I've never known him to have his house locked, and I soon learned that one was not expected to knock before entering. For a long time I entered through the front door, but in later years he was almost always in the back of the house, and I started using the back door instead. This necessitated coming through an enclosed back porch. While passing through this enclosure one day, I noticed an interesting, well-made broom shaped into a proper sweeping form from years of use. I assumed Alex had made it, and I carried it into his room to ask him about it. "Alex, Mutt tells me that you made this broom. Is this something you've been doing for a long time?" Everybody back then raised broom corn and made their own brooms. I learned to make brooms when I was a boy helping Grandma Stewart. There was an old preacher over here on Blackwater by the name of Lambert. His wife raised a lot of broom corn, but she couldn't tie brooms. She'd wrap a string around the stalks, but she couldn't make a broom that was any account. I was passing there one day and she said, "They tell me you can tie a broom that's worth something." "Well," I said, "you can sweep with them." She said, "Will you tie me one?" Well, it took me about 2 hours to fix and tie it right, trim the stalks and everything. You've got to keep all the short sweeps to themselves and the long ones to themselves to make a broom look right and sweep right. I graded them out according to size and tied 4 brooms. She said, "Now how much do I owe you?" I said, "I get 10 cents a broom." "Why, Lord," she said, "you got to have more than that," and she give me $1 for the 4. After that, somebody would send word every once in a while for me to come and tie some brooms for them. Here in later years, they got to selling store-bought brooms, but they're not near as good as the old-fashioned brooms if you make 'em right. Was broom corn hard to raise? When you're growing broom corn, you've got to break the tops over before it gets too ripe. If you wait till it gets red looking, then the broom straw is too brittle and your broom won't last. Break it over when it's green and tough, and it'll last twice as long. Now you take this broom, I've had it for several years, and it's half wore out, but it will still outlast a store-bought broom. In addition to straw brooms, Alex also made brooms from sedge grass and from hickory saplings. The latter is called a scrub broom because it was commonly used to scrub the log or puncheon floors in the early log houses. I'd heard about these pioneer scrub brooms, but the first one I ever saw was one Alex had made. The most practical yet simple feature about this type of broom is that the sweeping straws are shaved from the sapling and remain attached to the handle. After I expressed an interest in this innovative item from the past, Alex made several, giving them free of charge to anyone who expressed an interest in them. Eventually, there was such a demand he began to charge $1 for them. During our conversations, Alex frequently mentioned making trips to the mill to have his corn ground. Millstones have been used for grinding grain into flour and meal for thousands of years. The basic principle of stone grinding has remained essentially the same through the years. One stone, the bed stone, is fixed into a horizontal position. The top stone, or runner, is suspended over it by means of a vertical shaft. When powered, the shaft turns the runner stone and the grain is crushed between the two. A most important element in this operation is a series of grooves cut into the face of each of the two stones. This allows the meal or flour to be more properly ground, but the stones eventually wear, leaving the grooves shallow and ineffective. The deepening of these furrows is accomplished by carefully pecking them with a specially tempered steel hammer. The stones, often called burrs or burr stones, are made from a siliceous rock and are extremely hard. Some compare them to a diamond. Because of this hardness, the deepening of these grooves is extremely slow and laborious. The stroke must be hard enough to cut the stone, but if the stroke is too hard, it may crack or chip the entire stone, rendering it useless. It was a task requiring special skill, and only a very few people in any community would be trusted to do the job. We've talked about the old water mills that ground corn and wheat. Were you ever involved in sharpening the millstones? Yes, sir, I've sharpened millstones. You've got to know what you're doing, and it's hard work. I've sat a half a day at a time and pecked them rocks. If you're not careful, you'll get them grooves too wide or too deep, and they won't grind right. They have to be just right or they'll ruin your mill. Almost every time Alex finished a story, he'd reach for his tobacco twist, shaving off slivers of the brown twisted leaves to fill his pipe. All my life I've heard of a plug of tobacco, a term used to describe any pressed, store-bought chewing tobacco. I had no idea what the origin of the term was, but Alex soon enlightened me. You take a green hickory stick like you'd burn in the fireplace, about 6 inches in diameter. Take a 2-inch auger and bore in one end of the log just as far down as the auger will go, about 1.5 feet. You bore straight into the heart, right in the heart. You take your backer and stem and the leaves and take some brown sugar, dissolve it, and sprinkle it around on the leaves. Then you take the couple of leaves to wrap around the ones you sprinkled the sugar on. You don't want no sugar on the wrapping leaves. They'd be so sticky that you couldn't twist them with your hands. You twist them up and tamp them down in that hole. It will fool you at the backer you can put in there. You can get 2 or 3 pounds in a hole like that. You drive a wooden plug in that hole and take and put that log in the fire and leave it there till the bark is all burned off. You drive a wooden plug in that hole and take and put that log in the fire and leave it there till the bark is all burnt off. Then you take it out, and if it's a fire too bad, just take a little water and dampen it. Throw it out in the yard and let it lay there as long as you want to. Then split the wood open, and that plug of backer will be as round and solid as a stick of wood. And that's the best tobacco you've ever had in your life. Is that for chewing mostly? That's chewing tobacco, yeah. Oh, it's a heap harder than this bought tobacco. It would be so hard you could knock a bull down with it. You couldn't bite it off. You'd have to take your knife to cut you a chaw. You see, green hickory has a maple flavor to it, and that brown sugar just about matches it. By putting it in the log and letting it get hot and then letting it dry out, it gives it a flavor. That's how they got started calling chewing tobacco plug tobacco, because of that wood plug they used to stop up the hole. For 3/4 of a century or so, tobacco has been the #1 cash crop in much of our region. Did people raise it to sell when you were a boy? No, they never thought about selling it on the market or anywhere like that. Oh, if you run out, you might go to one of the neighbors and buy some, but there wasn't no market for it. In discussing tobacco and its uses, Alex got off on the subject of old women smoking pipes, and this led to a discussion on yet another Alex Stewart craft, pipe making. Yeah, my grandma and all those old women smoked pipes. Law, I've lit my granny's pipe many and many a time for her. Just dipped it in the fire. We didn't have no matches. I used to have some of their old pipes, and I give them away. I wish I'd kept them now. You make a mold first, and then you put some mud up just so stiff. You fill the mold plumb full of mud and tamp it in good and solid. There's some clay over here in that bottom that will make pipes and bricks too. There used to be an old brick kiln over there. You can cut little notches around down in your mold if you want to and make your pipe look pretty. When you get the mold full of mud, just take a little wooden pin and go right down in the center. That makes the bowl of your pipe. You can open up your mold and let it dry a while so you won't dent it when you burn it. Then put it in the fire and cover it up with ashes. Let it burn till it gets right. If you want a slick glaze, you put a little table salt on it. The women wore old homemade linsey dresses. Grandma had a great long pocket on one of her petticoats, and that's where she'd keep her pipe and her tobacco. Law, I've seen her many a time pull up her dress, it come down to her shoe tops, and reach in that old petticoat pocket and take out her pipe and backer. Why didn't she have the pocket on the outside of her dress? Well, if she had it on the outside, people would see it, and then too, she'd be getting the pocket caught on things. I understand that tobacco came from the Indians. Yeah, they got it off the Indians, and corn too. Grandpap said the Indians raised corn, cabbage, and tobacco. He told me that when the Lord made cabbage, the devil come along and seed it and said, I can make that too. Grandpap said he, the devil, went out and claimed he made cabbage, and when it come up, it was tobacco. And Alex laughed. Alex, I'm about to run out of trades and crafts to ask you about. What about barbering? Did you ever do that? He chuckles. I've cut hair all day long without stopping to eat a bite. People found out I could cut hair, and they'd come from all around. Didn't have no clippers back then. I just used a pair of scissors and a comb. How much did you charge for cutting hair? Oh, I never did charge them nothing. Some folks would give me a nickel if they had it. A lot of folks didn't have a nickel. I don't suppose there were any barber shops. We never heard of such a thing. The first barber shop ever I seed was down in Sneedville in an old log house. Back when I was growing up, people didn't cut their hair like they do now. Men would let their hair grow down to their shoulders, and every once in a while they'd reach around and whack off a little. The women wouldn't have their hair cut at all. Alex, when I was a child, I heard stories about crock haircuts. The old people supposedly would take a crock and place it upside down over the head and cut all the hair that wasn't covered. I always assumed these stories were told as jokes. Is there any truth in such tales? Yeah, I've heard of them doing that. Now, my mother had a big wooden ring, she called it, that she used to cut hair with. She'd set that on a boy's head, and she'd cut all the hair that stuck out. See, by using that, she could get it cut even all the way around. Sam Munsey, he was a preacher over here, went off somewhere and seed that men was shaving their hair cut off short, like they do now. Well, I'd been trimming the edge of his hair once in a while, and he put in for me to cut it the new way, and finally I did. It changed him so much, people didn't know him. He didn't favor himself. People laughed at him, and it was a sight to hear them talk. They said he was the funniest looking feller that they ever seed. But it wasn't long before other folks started having their hair cut like that, and that's when I had so much barbering to do. I was living over on Allie Mullen's place at the time. She was a widow woman and had 5 grown girls living with her, and I was going by there one day, and them girls stopped me. They wanted me to cut their hair. They'd been off somewhere and seen women with their hair cut. I wouldn't agree till Miss Mullins approved. They kept on after her, and finally she said, if nothing else will do them, go on and cut it. I set them down, and law, their hair come way down below their waist. I took and whacked it off and laid it in long straight piles on the floor, and I swear it looked right pitiful. Everybody just went on about how good them girls looked, and every woman might near it up and down that creek started coming to have me cut their hair. Didn't this interfere with your other work? Well, they generally come on Sundays. We always had our meetings, our church service, on Saturday. The Hancock County area is the only place I knew of where the practice of Saturday church services was and is followed. Although I made numerous inquiries, I was never able to learn anything about this custom. As Alex became older and less able to work outdoors, he stayed inside and started making smaller items. Every time I visited him, he had some new creations. For a few weeks, he got into making puzzles. He made several types, and I was curious as to where he'd learned how to make them. I recollect the first puzzle ever I seed. An old feller by the name of Mel Collins had it. I picked it up and looked at it, and he showed me how it worked. I was just a little feller, but I went home and made me one like it from my memory. That's the way I learned to make all these puzzles. Many of Alex's artistic accomplishments were directly connected to his memory of childhood experiences. When I visited him one day in November during his 92nd year, I discovered a different type of wood carving that he had just finished. It depicted 3 hounds barking up a tree which held 4 raccoons. The dogs were straining to reach as high up as they could, and the coons looked anxious. I was genuinely impressed and told Alex I'd like to buy one. He'd already promised this one to someone, but said he would make me another. In a few weeks, I got a letter from him saying he'd finished a carving which had 3 coons in a tree and a 4th lying on the ground among the dogs. The last part of the letter is a classic example of Alex's humor. It read, "John Rice, the dogs have already killed one of the coons, and if you don't hurry and get here, them hounds will kill the rest of them." People knowledgeable about American folk art are most impressed by this interesting creation, finding it hard to believe that this fine specimen wasn't the result of many years of practice. As indicated earlier, this work involving the coons and the hounds suddenly appeared on the scene, and I was curious as to why Alex chose that particular subject. He didn't know, he said. The ideal just came to him and he started whittling. But in a few minutes he told me about a coon hunt he'd experienced when he was a boy, making that long ago adventure come to life with his vivid description. The expertly carved raccoon sat beside Alex as he talked, and the animals looked disturbed and full of motion. I told him how much I liked it, and he sat in silence for a moment, and then he said, as though talking to himself, "They was a time when I don't believe anybody had handier hands than me, but they're not here now." So we'll stop right there. Another part of the book telling of the wondrous talents of Alex Stewart. Amazing. Now we find out he could even cut hair. He was even somebody that cut hair. Oh my goodness. You know, in one part of the book it's talking about that he started listing all the things he'd done and he gave up because he reached whatever number it was. It almost seems like the things that he was able to do would just be endless. I enjoyed all this part of the book. I especially liked that first part when he was talking about the plow, about making $12. Now maybe this was in later years, but compared to some of that other stuff that he sold for so cheap and made, you know, just cents, 10 cents or whatever, 25 cents. It seems like that was a lot of money, the plows, getting $12 for them. And as I said, that might have been later on in later years. I really liked the part, one little part I liked about when he was talking about the knitting, the lady, or this was about the spinning, the lady in Gatlinburg who thought he didn't know what he was talking about. But when he said that she didn't know straight up, I love that saying, and my husband says that a lot. He'll say that about somebody, why they didn't know straight up. So if you think about it, that's like a really way to say somebody that's clueless or doesn't have this not very bright or don't know what they're talking about, to say they don't know straight up. That's just a really descriptive way to say it, because if you don't know straight up, what do you know? So I really like that part because it reminds me of Matt. He uses that one a lot, don't know straight up. But I love the knitting part too. Granny's always been a crocheter, so I've been around that my whole life, but not so much the people that knit. Now, I'm really fascinated by the weaving and the spinning and all that. When you think about how people, you remember if you followed along with Dory, how her mother had to do that kind of stuff. And then by the time Dory once she was married and living, her and Fred, she bought her cloth from the store. She no longer had to weave and spin. But I really love that part. And I wish I had, that's one of the things I wish if I could have asked my grandmothers about. I asked Granny, but she don't really remember nobody doing anything like that. Now, my pap did tell me, his big grandma, they had sheep, so she had wool. So I'm like, okay, if she had wool, did she weave or spin? And he said she didn't like to weave or spin. She wanted to make quilts. So he has memories of like walking across the mountains to see the dockeries, and she would take the wool to trade with them, and then they would give her scraps and she would make blankets. She would rather make the blankets. So and he told me that, but I wish I had more information. I wish so many things I wish I could ask my grandmothers about stuff like that, because they probably likely would remember and probably either helped or at least remembered somebody, a grandmother or somebody doing it. So I find that part really interesting, and again, amazing that Alex learned how to do it. But that one little part gives us a clue. He says whenever he watched someone doing something, making something, he just wanted to know how to make it himself. So he had a real curiosity that really helped him learn all these amazing skills that he had. Some sort of surprising things in this part of the book. One was I was surprised that there was no market for tobacco. I thought that was really interesting. And then also that they had church on Saturday. And John Rice kind of says he could never find out why. So that was really interesting. Both of those two really stood out to me as surprising compared to other areas of Appalachia or other things that I've read or learned. So I thought both of those was really interesting, those two just really stark differences. I loved the little joke about the Lord making cabbage and the devil making tobacco. That's really cute. I like that. That was funny. I could see why Alex thought that was funny. And I love as he got older, he kept continuing to do different stuff, even down to the carving. Carving is such an art. I have a great video. If you've not seen it, I'll link to it. Dear friend Richard, who's a carver. It's such a talent, and then to see that Alex didn't pick it up really till he's older, till later in life, and then he made that. I love that. My Papa Wade was a coon hunter, so I grew up around coon dogs and coon hunting. I never went coon hunting, but both my brothers did, and Papa and my cousins, and Matt did when we were first married a lot. So I really love that's what he decided to actually carve and to put them on the little tree, to make a little tree and put the coons in the tree. That's just really fabulous. It is kind of a bittersweet part, that part when they're talking about the coons, is because Alex is again talking about how, at one time he didn't think anybody had handier hands than him, but he couldn't say that now. So you can tell he's definitely feeling his age, which he's in his 90s, but I hope to make it to 90, and then I hope that I'm still productive, that I'm still making something, I'm still doing something. So I hope that you enjoyed this part of the book, and I hope that you'll leave a comment. Let me know what jumped out at you, what you found interesting. And as always, I hope you drop back by next Friday, because we've got to see what happens next. That was the end of that chapter, kind of talking about the crafts, and I believe the next chapter is about medicinal remedies, those kind of things. So that'll be really interesting. So be sure to drop back by next Friday so we can find out more about that.